Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. A city sleeps best before dawn. In Stockholm's Bromma district, one window stays lit while the rest of the block is dark. By sunrise, paramedics will have hauled a woman from that room to an ambulance, and an incident report will start a national argument over what to call the violence that put her there. Pre-dawn in Stockholm. A man calls the emergency line, voice flat. Someone is hurt in an apartment in Bromma. Paramedics find a woman barely breathing. Massive, blunt trauma, no signs of a break-in, no weapon recovered. She will die in the hospital days later. The question that will divide Sweden isn't just who did this, but what the law should call it. The apartment door opens on a single contained scene. No kicked frame, no splintered lock. Inside, signs of struggle limited to the living area. Valuables are in place. First responders document a conscious effort to stabilize the airway and control bleeding. The clock matters. The call to Sweden's emergency number 112 hits the system at approximately 05:23. Neighbors report heavy thuds before sirens approach. Officers note a male at the address when they arrive. He speaks. He does not run. The victim is identified as Lotta Rudholm, 41. She's still alive when lifted from the floor and moved down the stairwell. That detail is not minor. It fixes the chain of events: assault in the apartment, medical intervention at scene, transport, and a death that occurs days later in a hospital bed. From the outset, investigators have no second location to chase. There is no alley, no parking lot, no late-night bar. The case begins and will remain anchored to a single door in Bromma. Forensics will later confirm what first responders saw in fast motion: blunt force trauma consistent with sustained striking by hands and/or household objects. No edged weapon recovered, no gunshot wound, no strangulation artifact. The pattern raises the question courts often have to answer. Was this a momentary loss of control or an assault carried out with an indifference to whether the victim would live? In rooms like this, clinicians write about damage. Courts read intent between the lines. Officers record early statements. The man at the scene acknowledges hitting. He frames it as a fight that went too far. That is common language in these rooms. What is not common is how tightly the physical picture fits the paperwork. One apartment, no forced entry, nothing stolen, no weapon found. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. You don't measure a case like this in adjectives. You measure it in marks, minutes, and movement. The marks are where the medical team says they are. The minutes are logged by a call center and a dispatcher. The movement is limited to a living room, a landing, a stretcher, and an ICU. From here, the investigation will step through 3 days that precede the call, the medical findings that follow, and the statements that try to reconcile the two. In cities like Stockholm, murders aren't just crimes. They test systems. Lotta Rudholm was 41, living alone in a small Bromma apartment that functioned like many city homes. Predictable routines, the same staircase, the same neighbors. Her world in the months before the assault is traceable in concrete ways: messages, photos, brief check-ins with friends. That is the value of context in a homicide file. Not biography for its own sake, but a record that can be cross-checked against what happened in one room before dawn. Her social sphere shows a short relationship that began online and moved quickly. Messages escalate from affectionate to controlling in a compressed window. Friends describe a recent pattern: last-minute cancellations, visible stress, and careful wording over the phone. Nothing here requires speculation. You can see it in the timestamps and the tenor of the texts. When someone begins to explain their own whereabouts in advance, unprompted, that is not a lifestyle note. It is an accommodation to scrutiny. There is documentation that matters because it fixes risk in time. Lotta kept images of fresh injuries. The photos are date-stamped and forwarded to a confidant as a form of self-record. She mentioned fear in language that is restrained, not theatrical. These records do not decide a case on their own, but they later reduce argument about whether violence was a first event or part of a pattern. If a jury needs to understand why an assault inside a private home can be foreseeable, this is the lane. Prior injury evidence, corroborated by third-party receipt, saved before the final incident. Police contacts in the period before the assault reflect what many domestic violence files look like: concern communicated, safety advice provided, a threshold not fully crossed. No restraining order appears in the public summaries tied to Lada at that moment. That absence does not cancel risk. It means the system had limited leverage until a charging event. In practice, investigators don't infer safety from missing paperwork. They look at behavior, monitoring, unannounced visits, pressure to respond quickly. Those are the signals that show up across cases regardless of country. The building offers a baseline that complements her records. No reports of a stranger working the entry, no pattern of thefts. Neighbors who know faces and habits describe the nights as ordinary, right up until the thuds and the arrival of first responders. That matters because it narrows opportunity. If there is no sign of forced entry and no history of a prowler, the circle of possible perpetrators is not theoretical. It is defined by access and proximity. Digital traces fill in edges without overreaching. The days before the assault show fewer outgoing messages from Lada and more reactive ones. Response time lengthens. Friends note she deflects invitations with non-specific reasons. In isolation, any one of these is nothing. Together, they form a pre-incident state consistent with many intimate partner homicide files, a victim trying to manage risk while keeping daily life intact. In towns like Duluth or cities like Stockholm, murders aren't just crimes. They test whether warning signs register before it is too late. It is useful to separate two questions now so the narrative stays coherent. First, what do we know about Lada's situation before the assault based on records and third-party accounts? Second, how do those facts intersect with the single crime scene documented in Bromma? The answer to the first establishes a risk environment. The answer to the second explains why the case did not expand beyond one door. When public debate later focused on labels, murder versus anything less, these pre-incident materials became central. They show a context that law must weigh when it evaluates intent and indifference. There is also the human dimension that needs no embellishment. Lada's choices in the weeks before the attack, saving images, forwarding messages, keeping a thread open with someone she trusted, reflect what many victims do when they do not yet have a prosecutable event but feel escalation. Those steps do not guarantee safety, but they create a record that can support accountability after the fact, and in some cases trigger earlier intervention. That is the narrow value we can extract without sentiment. Documentation is not a solution, but it can be the difference between ambiguity and proof. For viewers, the important takeaway in this phase is simple. When you see a loved one shift from normal planning to preemptive explanations, when injuries are reframed as clumsiness while new rules appear around communication, those are not talk show signals. They are case elements. If we want to understand why a file like this moves fast from call to charge, this is why. The past was preserved just enough to make the present legible. 72 hours before the emergency call, Lada Rudholm's routine looks ordinary on paper. A handful of messages sent to friends, a short grocery run, confirmed by a receipt she forwarded for budgeting, and a night at home. Nothing in those entries suggests an outside threat moving through her building or a stranger scouting the address. What does shift subtly at first is how she communicates. Replies get shorter. Plans are postponed without specifics. People who know her notice the tone change even if they can't name a cause. That is where a clean timeline starts. With small timestamp deviations, you can verify. At -48 hours, the pattern tightens. Outgoing messages slow further. Incoming messages stack. A friend asks if she's still up for a coffee. The response lands late and non-committal. Investigators don't read emotions into that. They read cadence. When a person who usually answers within minutes takes hours, that variance becomes a marker you can carry forward. No neighbor reports unknown visitors. Entry to the building shows no sign of tampering. The circle of access stays limited to people Lada would reasonably allow near her door. -24 hours, her phone activity narrows to short exchanges about staying in. The content itself is neutral. The context is not. Earlier, we established that Lada had documented prior injuries and shared those records with a confidant. Here, the timeline tells you she is in a management phase, remaining home, reducing contact, keeping decisions small. For a prosecutor, that matters because it frames foreseeability. For a defender, it matters because it doesn't yet prove intent. For an investigator, it is the scaffold that will either hold the rest of the case or collapse under contradiction. Minus 10 hours, a neighbor recalls routine sounds from the apartment. Music briefly, then quiet. There is no report of an argument in the hallway, no complaint to building management, no late-night guests wandering the wrong floor. When the state later argues there was no forced entry, this segment of the spine supports it. Nothing from the exterior suggests a breach. Everything points inward, toward the dynamics inside the unit. Minus 3 hours, Lotta's phone pings the network in a way consistent with being stationary at home. There is no ride-share history to other addresses, no sudden out-of-pattern movement. That is not a dramatic clue. It is a stabilizer. Cases break coherence when the timeline scatters across locations that can't be reconciled with the scene. This one doesn't. It contracts toward a single point. Minus 90 minutes. Contact from friends goes unanswered. That is common in late evenings and not alarming on its own. Combined with the earlier slowdown, it helps set the window in which the assault likely begins. A narrow window is valuable because it can be tested against everything else: noise complaints, the emergency call, the documented state of the room. If those elements disagree, investigators know to look for a missing piece. Here, they do not disagree. The last segment is measured in minutes. Thuds heard by neighbors align with the time the call hits the dispatch system. The caller identifies the address, states that a woman is injured, and remains on scene when first responders arrive. Paramedics find Lotta alive. That detail closes the loop on where and when the assault took place. The apartment is not a discovery made later. It is the origin, confirmed by the chain of care from floor to stretcher to hospital. There is no credible second scene to introduce and no off-site struggle to chase. The timeline built from phone activity, neighbor statements, and the dispatch log makes that clear. What this spine does not do is declare motive or legal labels. It doesn't have to. Its job is to hold the facts steady, so the next steps, medical findings, statements, and, later, charging decisions, can be weighed against a sequence that doesn't shift. When audiences say a story feels like two different cases, it is usually because the chronology is loose. This one is not. It tightens as it approaches the call, and it ends where the medical team begins. There is a human reason to care about this level of precision. People around Lotta did what people often do. They checked in, they adjusted plans, they noticed stress. Documentation helps after the fact, but earlier recognition helps before it. If you recognize this pattern in someone close, fewer plans, vague deflections, sudden schedule control, ask directly and offer a safe place to talk. It isn't sensational. It is how preventable harm sometimes gets interrupted. The medical record starts the moment paramedics remove Lotta Rudholm from the Bromma apartment and continues without a gap. Airway support, bleeding control, transport, intake at the nearest emergency department. She is alive on arrival. That single fact fixes the sequence. Assault occurred in the apartment. The medical fight to keep her alive happened in the hospital. There is no second crime scene to discover later and no lost interval to speculate about. Emergency clinicians document what they see: objective injuries, vitals, responsiveness. Notes describe craniofacial trauma consistent with sustained striking, not a single accidental fall. There is no documentation of a weapon recovered from the room or from the patient. No edged wounds, no gunshot, no strangulation groove. Swelling and hemorrhage map to repeated impact. When investigators talk about pattern, they mean this: injuries that line up with force applied multiple times, not once. Imaging follows stabilization. Scans establish the extent of internal damage. Those images are not arguments, they are measurements. They show the kind of injury that creates a narrow window for survival even with rapid intervention. The team moves her to a higher level of care. Over the next days, despite treatment, the complications of the trauma lead to death. The hospital declares, and the case transitions formally to the medical examiner. The chain of custody on evidence, clothing, photographs, swabs, remains intact from arrival to autopsy. Cause and manner are the two words that always matter here. Cause of death speaks to physiology, what actually ended a life. Manner of death classifies the event: natural, accident, suicide, undetermined, or homicide. In Lotta's file, cause reflects complications of blunt force head trauma. Manner is homicide. That classification does not assign intent by itself. It establishes that another person's actions, not disease or accident, set the death in motion. Courts will later weigh whether that conduct amounts to murder or something lesser. The medicine does its part by being precise and limited. Size disparity becomes relevant when you examine how much force is needed to produce the documented injuries. Lada is a 41-year-old woman of average build. The male present at the apartment, who called the emergency line and remained on scene, was significantly larger. That doesn't prove intent. It does show capacity to inflict the level of damage observed without a weapon. When prosecutors later argue obvious indifference to whether she died, they are not importing poetry into a courtroom. They are pointing to what the body shows after repeated blows. Toxicology is routine in cases like this. Results can tell you if the victim had alcohol or medication in her system that might blunt reactions or impair defense. They can also rule out explanations that do not fit. None of this changes the timeline, but it can explain why there were no defensive injuries typical of a prolonged fight. If a victim is stunned early, the rest of the assault becomes one-sided. That is consistent with what clinicians recorded. Catastrophic head injury, limited capacity to respond. The hospital photographs are clinical, distance, close-up, scale reference. They exist so that what begins as medical documentation can later be used in court without ambiguity. The living room disturbance recorded by first responders is the start. The hospital record is the continuation. Together they create one story that doesn't depend on an officer's memory or a narrator's adjectives. It is difficult to argue with the alignment, a narrow window of time, consistent neighbor accounts, a call to the emergency line at approximately 05:23, and injuries that match a sustained assault concluded shortly before the call. Defense strategy in assaults that end in death often stakes ground on intent. The line is familiar. There was a fight, it escalated, the outcome was never intended. The medical file pushes back by quantifying force and repetition. You cannot tell a jury how a person felt. You can show them what repeated impacts do to bone and brain, and how long it takes for those injuries to become fatal. When those numbers are paired with the dispatch clock, the distance between words and outcomes narrows. It doesn't erase reasonable doubt by itself, but it reduces the room where doubt can live. The absence of a weapon matters for a different reason. When injuries reach a lethal threshold without a tool, the law asks whether stopping was possible and not done. Each additional blow after incapacitation adds weight to the argument that the assailant acted with disregard for survival. In many jurisdictions, including Sweden, that line is where courts separate extreme assault from murder. The district court in this case will later adopt language about indifference to whether she lived or died. That language tracks back to what the hospital and the autopsy recorded in numbers, not adjectives. One operational note from the investigative side. Cases collapse when medical documentation is incomplete, late, or inconsistent. That did not happen here. EMS timestamps, hospital intake, imaging reports, and autopsy findings align. The data doesn't try to tell a story. It stays in its lane, and by doing that, supports the story the evidence makes. The data aligned cleanly. In many investigations, that invites caution. In this one, the alignment is expected because the scene and the medical course are both contained. One apartment, one patient, one hospital, one outcome. There is a human angle we should not skip, even with a report-style tone. Medical teams fight to stabilize the living, then preserve evidence respectfully when survival is no longer possible. Families won't read every line of a scan report, but those pages carry real weight later. They turn grief into proof. That is part of why the public conversation around this case reached beyond a single defendant to the broader question of how intimate partner violence is labeled and punished. For viewers following this file, here's the practical bridge to the next segment. Medicine has described what happened to Lada's body and when. The next phase asks how statements at the apartment, before and after the call, stack against these findings. If someone says, "It got out of hand," the documentation lets a jury measure what out of hand looks like in broken structures and lost function. The interview room is quiet, the record light on. The man who called the emergency line sits across from detectives. He confirms he was in the Bromma apartment before dawn. He says there was an argument. He says he hit her. He adds a phrase that shows up in case files everywhere. It got out of hand. The statement matters because it anchors him inside the only crime scene we have and concedes force. What remains is measure and intent, and those are weighed against the clock and the medical file you've already seen. Detectives start where the timeline left off. The dispatcher log marks the call at approximately 05:23. Neighbors describe heavy impacts just minutes earlier. Hospital notes show recent repeated blows consistent with a short, violent window. His narrative has to fit that window. When he suggests a brief scuffle, investigators compare that to injury pattern and duration. Craniofacial trauma at that level rarely comes from one strike. It comes from sustained force. The contradictions don't require an argument. They sit next to each other on a screen. They work the room evidence with the same restraint. No forced entry at the door, no valuables disturbed. That supports a domestic dynamic, not a break-in. He doesn't contest that he was there or that he placed the call. He doesn't claim a third party. In many cases, that admission narrows debate to what he intended versus what occurred. Here, because the hospital record is clean and the timeline tight, the gap between his phrasing and the outcome feels smaller than his words suggest. Phone extractions provide the next layer. In the hours before the assault, his messages show monitoring behavior, asking location, pushing for responses, double texting when replies slow. Lada's side is short and non-committal, in line with the change we saw over the last 72 hours. There's no need to dramatize that. The timestamps do the work. Investigators also pull historical exchanges, earlier arguments, apologies that follow, promises to change. Those threads don't convict by themselves. They show trajectory. In cases of intimate partner violence, trajectory often explains why there is no defensive injury profile, because fear, compliance, or a first disabling blow shuts down resistance early. The interview comes back to the room and the sequence. He places himself in the argument. He acknowledges hitting. He doesn't claim a weapon. That aligns with the scene and the medical file. Where it breaks is repetition and restraint. Detectives ask how many times he struck. He can't or won't fix a number. The hospital record does not need exact counts. It conveys repetition through patterns of injury. The more he minimizes, the more the documentation carries weight. Neighbors' statements close the loop. They heard multiple thuds, not a single bang, no voices in the hall, no doors slamming. The sound profile matches the window before the call and stops when sirens near the building. That is what investigators expect when someone chooses to call for help after a sustained assault. Violence first, intervention second. The order matters for intent. Choosing to call does not erase what happened before the decision. From the investigation side, there is a point in every interview when the goal shifts from getting more words to testing the ones already given. Detectives ask him to walk through the minute before the call. Did he try to render aid? Did he leave the room? Did he step outside to get reception? The answers are checked against the emergency transcript and the first responder notes. If he says he rolled her into recovery position, EMS should find her that way. If he says she was responsive, clinicians should record eye-opening or verbal response. In this case, the medical record shows catastrophic injury and limited responsiveness. His phrasing, a fight that went too far, doesn't square with the damage described. There is a human element here that isn't theater. In domestic settings, victims often try de-escalation strategies long before police ever get involved. They craft replies. They document injuries. They shrink their world to stay safe. When someone admits to hitting and frames it as momentary, the pre-incident record shows whether that's plausible or part of a pattern. Lada's documentation, saved before the final assault, undercuts the idea that this was a first-time loss of control. It doesn't decide intent alone, but it narrows the places where a defense can stand. The last piece of this phase is procedural, not dramatic, corroboration. Statements are mapped onto a grid of times and findings. Where a line doesn't match, it's marked. Where it does, it's accepted. Investigators do not need a confession to murder. They need a narrative that can survive contact with evidence. Here, the evidence says the assault was inside one apartment in a tight window with force applied multiple times, resulting in injuries few survive. His own words put him at the center of that sequence. His claim that it went too far does not conflict with guilt. It simply declines to name it. A quick note on why this matters beyond one room in Stockholm. Cases like this teach the same lesson across cities and systems. Documentation beats rhetoric. Doctors document what they can measure. Dispatchers log the second a call hits. Neighbors record what they heard and when they heard it. When those lines point in the same direction, juries have less to guess at. And when the file is this consistent, prosecutors feel more confident asking a court to call the conduct what it is under law, not under softer language. We'll hold the identity reveal for the courtroom section, where the charge, verdict, and sentence will be squarely on the record. For now, the interview and the evidence sit together. One admits contact and force, the other measures how far it went. If you've followed us this far, ask yourself a simple question we ask in every file. If the words and the injuries cannot live in the same room, which one leaves? The courtroom is where anonymity ends. On the charge sheet and in open court, the defendant is named Martin Johnson, age 33 at the time. Prosecutors set out a direct, evidence-led theory. The assault happened inside Lotta Rudholm's Bromma apartment within the narrow window established by the dispatch log and neighbors' statements. Medical findings showed repeated blunt force impacts to the head, injuries few people survive even with rapid care. There was no weapon recovered because one wasn't required. The state's position was straightforward. The force used, the repetition, and the aftermath demonstrated obvious indifference to whether she lived or died, language the court would later adopt. The case did not rely on spectacle. It relied on alignment. The call to Sweden's emergency line, 112, time-stamped around 05:23. The neighbors who heard multiple impacts just before sirens arrived. The paramedics who found Lotta alive on the floor and transferred her to hospital. The hospital that documented catastrophic head trauma, and the medical examiner who signed a homicide manner of death tied to blunt force trauma. Each element had a provenance: audio, notes, scans, photographs. No single exhibit was sensational. Together they left little room for a narrative built on a single accidental blow. The defense position followed a familiar path in domestic homicides. Counsel conceded an argument and conceded hitting. They resisted the label murder, emphasizing the absence of a weapon, the defendant's later decision to call for help, and the claim that events escalated beyond intent. To a jury, those are points meant to reduce moral blame. To a trial judge in Sweden, they are weighed against proof of sustained force, the size disparity between defendant and victim, and the medical record's clarity on repetition and severity. The court's role was not to measure remorse after the fact, but to classify conduct as the law understands it. Testimony from first responders and clinicians bridged the scene to the hospital without gaps. A responding officer described what was and wasn't disturbed. A living area showing a struggle, a door without forced entry, valuables left in place. An emergency physician explained the injury pattern in plain terms. These were not the injuries of a brief scuffle. They were the injuries of multiple strikes. Toxicology, introduced to complete the medical picture, did not provide an alternative mechanism that could transform the episode into an accident. When the defense returned to the idea that the fight got out of hand, the state pointed back to the timeline and the scans. If it was momentary, why the pattern consistent with repetition? The court analyzed intent through conduct. In Swedish practice, murder does not require a confession of purpose. It can be established by the obvious risk of death and the decision to continue anyway. The judge's reasoning, summarized on the record, tracked to that line. A series of blows delivered by a significantly larger offender to the head of a smaller victim in a confined space, ending in injuries few survive, followed by a call for help that came only after the damage was done. The decision to call emergency services did not erase the conduct that required the call. When the verdict was read, the language was spare. Guilty of murder. The sentence, life imprisonment. It is not a word for emotion. It is a legal term of art in Sweden that sets custody to an indeterminate span, subject to later review. What matters for the public record is the court's classification of the act and the penalty entered that day. The judge's remarks underscored the same theme that ran through the file. Sustained force, extreme injury, and indifference to the outcome. Administrative details, credit for time held, custody assignment, were logged and moved to corrections. Families rarely care about those pages, but they are how a court's words become days in a cell. For viewers who have followed the evidence from the apartment to the hospital, this moment closes one half of the legal arc. The identity is now on the record. The label murder is now on the record. The sentence life is now on the record. In the next stage, the defense will ask another court to recalibrate penalty. Appeals don't rerun scenes. They test law and proportionality against the same set of facts. Before we go there, hold the core of what was proven here. The scene was one apartment. The injuries were the result of repeated force, and the court called that murder. An appeal doesn't replay a crime scene. It tests the law applied to it. After the district court's life sentence, the defense took the case to the Svea Court of Appeal. The record was the same. One apartment in Bromma, a tight pre-dawn window, medical findings of repeated blunt force trauma, a homicide manner of death. What changed was not the facts, but how punishment should track those facts under Swedish sentencing practice. Prosecutors argued to keep life. Their position was that the district court got it right. Sustained force against a vulnerable target in a confined space showed a level of indifference that justified the system's harshest penalty. The defense leaned on recalibration. They didn't erase the medical picture or the timeline. They argued that the court should impose a time-limited sentence rather than life, pointing to the defendant's call to the emergency line after the assault, the absence of a weapon, and the framework Swedish courts use when stepping down from life in homicide cases. The appellate judges approached the file the way they are trained to do, element by element against precedent. Intent remained established, not by a confession of purpose, but by the obvious fatal risk created by repeated head strikes and the decision to continue. That part did not move. What moved was the penalty. On review, the court set a fixed term of 18 years. In plain language, the appeal accepted the murder classification but concluded that, within Sweden's proportionality scale, the case belonged with long but time-limited sentences rather than life. Public reaction was immediate, and it wasn't just about numbers. For many in Sweden, Lotta Rudholm had become a name in a wider debate about how to label and punish intimate partner homicide. Femicide wasn't a courtroom term. It was a societal one. The prosecution service, through the Attorney General, Riksåklagaren, sought leave for the Supreme Court to review the penalty and restore life. The High Court did not take the case. In practice, that meant the 18-year sentence set by the Court of Appeal became the controlling judgment. It's important to be clear about what this decision did and didn't do. It didn't downplay the severity of the assault or question the trial court's view of intent. It recalibrated punishment within the structure Sweden uses. Life is reserved, and not every murder results in life. Where the district court saw a threshold crossed, the appellate court placed the case just below that bar. The law in one paragraph, murder affirmed, sentence set at 18 years. Because this is Sweden, one more point needs to be stated without drama or confusion. Conditional release typically occurs after serving 2/3 of a fixed term, subject to correctional assessments and any subsequent decisions. That is a general practice explanation, not a prediction, and it should never be mistaken for an early out. Families experience these distinctions as deeply as any verdict. The system records them in precise language because those words become years. In true crime storytelling, this is where many narratives break into two versions of the same case. We won't do that here. There is one arc. The district court entered life. The appeal set 18 years. The Attorney General tried to restore life. The Supreme Court did not take it. As of October 10, 2025, the standing sentence in Stockholm, Sweden for the murder of Lotta Rudholm by Martin Johnson is 18 years imprisonment. That is the outcome you can put on screen and not have to correct later. A final note of humanity, kept short. Legal language is exact because people live with the consequences. When communities argue about labels, families live with dates. Precision honors both. When the courtroom emptied, the file didn't end, it moved. After the life term at trial was replaced on appeal, Svea Court of Appeal fixed the punishment at 18 years imprisonment for the murder of Lotta Rudholm. The Attorney General asked the Supreme Court to restore life. The court did not take the case. That's the law's last word. As of October 10, 2025, in Stockholm, Sweden, the standing judgment against Martin Johnson is 18 years. What followed was custody, not controversy. Sweden's system recorded placement, transfers, and at points escorted, time-limited permissions, supervised outings that do not change a sentence or erase a conviction. Families hear permission and feel risk. Corrections hear management and cite policy. Both truths can exist. What cannot be confused is status. There was no release and no second outcome hiding in the paperwork. Outside institutions, people closest to Lotta kept the focus where it belonged. Before the assault, she had done what many try when danger grows without a clear legal foothold. She saved messages, documented injuries, stayed in touch with someone she trusted. Those actions didn't save her life, but they made the case legible. In intimate partner violence, clarity isn't a headline. It's leverage for responders and proof for courts. If you see control replacing care, if explanations start arriving before questions, ask directly, and offer a safe path to help. Early attention is not drama, it's prevention. Our story stayed linear because the evidence did. One apartment in Bromma, a pre-dawn 112 call, hospital care that ended in death, murder at trial, 18 years on appeal, no alternate scene, no competing ending. Precision matters because families live with dates, not adjectives. Honoring Lada means getting the record right and using it to recognize escalation sooner in the next life that looks ordinary until it isn't. I've walked you through one apartment, one call, one verdict. Here's what I carry forward. Control isn't love, and silence isn't safety. If someone starts managing your time, isolating you, or setting new rules, say it and document it early. As friends and neighbors, we can be that lifeline. What should justice do better in cases like this? Did any detail echo something you've witnessed? Your insight might help someone reading the comments tonight. If this reached you, comment where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. If it didn't land, tell me why. Let's learn together.